I had this conversation with Cornel West when he came on the show. And when he came on the show, I was a supporter of his. And when he left, I wasn't. And I tried to impress upon him that when he talks about white supremacy, the majority of people in America who are poor are white. And if you're going to try to lecture coal miners about white supremacy, it's going to fall flat. And if he's out there being a black activist, he could talk about white supremacy. But if you're trying to run for president and actually oppose the establishment, the last thing you should do is try to lead with trans issues or LGBTQ or because you know what? If you get a living wage for everybody, that helps everybody, especially trans and LGBTQ, black and white. If you get health care for everybody, that helps everybody, meaning black and white. So if you start to, what the establishment wants people like Cornel West to do is to keep talking about white supremacy, to keep talking about trans issues, to keep talking about LGBTQ as if they're an oppressed minority like they were in the 90s when I started comedy. Back then, they couldn't get married. They could get fired from their job. They couldn't get housing. That's all over. They have and so to keep pretending like we're living 30 years ago is exactly what the establishment wants to do. And by the way, all this talk about trans issues and talk about white, this doesn't come from the grassroots up. This comes directly from BlackRock and Larry Fink. This comes from Vanguard. This is so the most murderous companies who are raping the planet can shroud themselves in an air of virtue. And how do they do it? They do it by trans issues and LGBTQ and white supremacy and inclusion and equity and all that stuff. And that's there to keep us divided, because the only thing that scares the establishment is when people from the left and the right realize they have more in common that divides us, and they have shared enemy, and that shared enemy is the oligarchy. That's the only thing that scares them. And so if they can keep us talking about race, and if they can keep us talking about gender and ethnicity, that's a gift to them, because it keeps everybody divided. Would you agree with that?
Well, none of it agree with it vehemently. And that was so nicely explained. I can't really add much to it other than to say there's been research on this. I'm sure you've seen this. The incidence of the phrase racist, white supremacist, white nationalist in the New York Times, which is easily searchable, shot up right after Occupy Wall Street. So I'm not alleging a conspiracy. I think it's a conspiracy of instinct. Like, oh, wait, the one thing you can't criticize is finance. Let's get the peasants mad at each other. There's no question about that. I mean, in my opinion, watching the real crimes are mostly financial. And I'm just amazed. I've lived here for 54 years, and I have never one time on television or any public forum with a big audience heard a real debate about taxes. So we tax people twice as much for working as we do for investing. Why do we do that? I mean, right? So does that mean that investing is twice as virtuous as working? Do we seek to discourage work? I mean, we seek to discourage smoking. That's why we tax cigarettes so heavily. But we tax work at twice the rate of investing. So we're saying investors are twice as good people. They're making twice as important a moral choice as someone who just goes to work every day. Like, that's insane. Why don't we have parity in tax rates? And by the way, maybe there's some like crazy complex economic reason that we don't. I don't know. I'm very open-minded. Maybe if we did that, America would collapse. Why don't you explain it to me? Why don't you explain that to me? Why people are getting taxed at half the rate for investing that I'm paying for working? And no one can. And by the way, well, maybe someone can. No one has, because we've never had that debate. It's more like, oh, trans lives or some stupid academic bullshit debate about, I don't know what. And none of this stuff is relevant to even to me. And I'm not I make a lot more than the average person. You know, what if I made 50 grand a year? This would be a deeply relevant debate. But America has not been treated to that debate because we're arguing about race and endless race stuff. And last point, which is obvious, I'm not sure anybody could find tangible ways in which any Black American or any white American has benefited from the furious debate and chin-tugging and yelling about race over the past 5 years. If you can find one person other than the chicks who run BLM who have all those houses.
Talcum Eggs. You know Talcum Eggs.
Oh, okay.
I love
Sean
him.
White,
No, but I mean, aside from like the obvious charlatans, and I'm sorry, I was going to add one thing because I know Cornell and I've always really liked Cornell. I went to Africa with him 20 years ago with Sharpton and had the best time ever. And I think he's legit smart. I will say that. I mean, he like reads Russian language, which is hard. And he has good instincts, but the fact that his default is always this shallow, effectively neoliberalism, which he would hate it if he heard me say that, but it's true. Why is that? He knows better. He's not dumb. He knows what's happening. And the truth is just to cover. It's his defense mechanism. Like he doesn't want to, he does kind of want, still an endowed chair at Princeton. So if they come for him at all, he's like, race, trans, whatever. Like it's purely his force field. That's all it is. That's my opinion.
So
anyway.
So you are correct. I was a big fan of Dr. Cornel West again until he came on my show, and then he is really smart, like you said. He reads Russian, all this stuff. And that's why it was so disappointing when he pretended he was dumber than a pothead jagoff comedian for that entire interview.
Exactly.
He tried to make the case that Donald Trump tried to overthrow the peaceful transfer of power on January 6th, which I know he's smarter than. And a bunch of Second Amendment gun nuts showed up at the Capitol to try to overthrow the government, and son of a bitch, they all forgot their guns. Isn't that the weirdest thing? Oh my God. It's like, Vinny, you didn't bring the guns? No, I brought the mittens. Anyway, of course, he knows better. And then I tried to point out that, one of his issues is Stop Cop City, people who are protesting the expansion of the police state in Atlanta. And I tried to point out to him that the same RICO laws that, by the way, were invented to go after the mafia, which was why everybody was okay with them. Well, you're only going to use them to go after the mafia. Well, now they're using them to go after Donald Trump, a former president who is a political enemy of the establishment and the number one opponent of the current president, Joe Biden. They used the RICO statute to go after him and indict him. Not only did they use the same RICO statute to go after Stop Cop City protesters, they used the same grand jury. The same grand jury indicted them. And I tried to point that out to Cornel West. And when I said, you see the game that's being played now, he pretended he didn't. And then he called me a Trumper. And so for that, I don't think I can forgive him. And I won't. And I won't stop bringing it up either. Just like I won't stop bringing up John.
That's just so, but it's so sad though. It's so sad. I mean, because Cornel, the whole shtick is I'm a free man. I'm totally, I'm an old blues man. He's always saying that, right? And he could be. He actually could be a free man because he has all the qualities required. He's self-aware. He's smart. He's wildly articulate, and he's a good dude, actually, in my opinion. So why not be? And I think he's had a series of very complex personal life, and they basically just kind of have him. Like he needs the gig, and so he has to repeat the slogans.
And that's why
it bums me out every time I see him.
It totally bummed me out, and I tried to impress upon him, why do you call Donald Trump a fascist and you won't call Joe Biden a fascist? And you pretend like fascism only comes when Donald Trump is president. We're living in it. We just lived through 3 years of COVID fascism. You were presented with it, and when presented with it and the chance to fight against it, you turned a blind eye to it on purpose, and that's what he did. And his whole class did that because Cornel West is not from the working class. I'm from the fucking working class, not Cornel West. He's lived in ivory towers his whole goddamn life. I was a bricklayer. I worked in masonry. I drove a forklift. I was in the Teamsters. I've been a fucking stand-up comedian for 30 years. There was nothing more blue collar than banging your head against that comedy wall and entertaining drunks at midnight. I've come from that world, not him. So he lives in ivory towers, and you're always going to be a class loyal, and that's what he was, and that's what he proved to be on my show, and that's what was really disheartening. And he knows he's wrong.
You don't have to be, though. You don't have to be. I will say, as I was hearing about how you grew up, it's like the opposite of how I grew up. And I've kind of reached a lot of the same conclusions that you have, but maybe for different reasons. I just concluded that world is not worth living in. The people aren't that interesting. It's not that great, actually. All the things that people aspire to, when you see it, you're like, it's not that impressive. I don't want to live like that. I don't want to be around those people. And so like the closer you get, so that's kind of the sad thing. It's like, even if you succeed, if you keep collecting merit badges and wind up wherever you think you want to be on someone's private plane, it's like with Larry Fink, you realize, like, I don't really want to be on a plane with Larry Fink. He's a pig, actually. He's kind of dumb. He's like smart in some specific way that's made him a billionaire, but like, he's not a great person. His wife doesn't respect him, that's for sure, or whatever. Like the familiarity with that world breeds more than contempt. It breeds loathing. At least that's how I feel. Like, I have zero interest in ever being in polite society ever again. And that's as heartfelt a statement as I can make.
I'm right there with you, brother.